This is our second lecture on the canon of the Old Testament. And in our first lecture, we talked about the different communities that seem to have somewhat different canons, or might possibly have different canons. Evidence from the Septuagint that they may have books other than the books that are in our Hebrew Bibles as being canonical. Qumran may have left out Esther. The rabbis question 5 different books. And does the evidence from this material leave us with the possibility that the canon wasn't fully closed at the end of the first century? And at this point, I'd like to move on to a very influential attempt to explain the history of the canonization of the Old Testament. This was, we'll call it the liberal theory. It's Ryle's theory concerning the canonization of the Old Testament. And he's going to argue that, first of all, the law was canonized around 400 BC. Then the books of the prophets were canonized around 200 BC. And the books of the writings were not canonized until into the Christian era around AD 90. Now, a little bit about Ryle. His book, The Canon of the Old Testament, it's been reprinted, as you can see this modern printing of it in the picture. But the Canon of the Old Testament was originally written, the second edition was 1909, and it became the liberal manual for the canon of the Old Testament. Though not a few Roman Catholics have found the theory attractive as well, for reasons we'll bring up here in just a moment. And part of the theological significance of this theory is that it assumes that the canon was open until well into the Christian era, around AD 90. And by positing an open canon until AD 90, well, this undermines the Protestant doctrine of sola scriptura. In other words, the argument is that since the canon remained open at the time of Christ, it's only the church that determined what books are in the Bible, not Christ or the apostles, but post-apostolic. And that in turn implies that this doctrine of Scripture alone is the source of biblical Christian authority is undermined as well. So it's kind of an important thing theologically if Ryle's interpretation of things is true. So let's look at it. He argues, first of all, that the law came to be, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, the Pentateuch, that it only came to be canonized around 400 BC at the time of Ezra. Now, they would argue that, even that comes in stages. The first stage would come around 621 BC when, according to liberal theory, Deuteronomy came to be accepted by Josiah as scripture, and so at least Proto-Deuteronomy existed by then, and that gave you all the books. But then there was editing and priestly material added, and it wasn't completed until around 400 BC at the time of Ezra. And we'll talk, I have another lecture that talks about this process. It relates to the documentary hypothesis that sees the Pentateuch is completed around 400 BC. Wellhausen, who held to the documentary hypothesis, posited that it was Ezra who actually completed the work. But in any case, around 400 BC would be when you get the law accepted as scripture. And then The prophets come later. Now, the prophets may have been accepted as canonical in some sense before 200 BC at various times, but it could only be canonical as a group after Malachi had completed his work, and everybody, even us conservatives, agree that Malachi dates at least to the 5th century BC. So you have to have Malachi completed before you could have the canon of the prophets completed. And if you allow time for redactions and additions, well, that would give you a date of approximately 200 BC. They'll also use this to explain why Daniel was not in the canon, because they date Daniel later than 200 BC in their particular critical interpretation of Daniel. And then the writings come last of all around AD 90. The writings are the last division of the Hebrew canon to be closed. This explains, by the way, the threefold division of the canon, the law, the prophets, and the writings, that they simultaneously represent stages in the canonization of Scripture. So the law was accepted as Scripture first, the prophets secondly, and the writings last of all. And since liberal scholarship dates Daniel to about 160 something BC, the canonization of this division must be later than that. Now, we conservatives would dispute that. They believe Daniel to be a fictional book, and Daniel was not a real person. He's a fictional character, basically. We conservatives would not agree with that, but that's the liberal view, and that's how Ryle thinks. Now, what Ryle proposed was there was a key event in which the canon came to be completed. That key event is what he called the Council of Jamnia, or Jamne. It was a rabbinic council that debated the canonicity of Ecclesiastes and perhaps Song of Solomon. And this event in AD 90, in Ryle's view, marks the close of the canon of the Old Testament. R.H. Pfeiffer comments this way. He says, at the close of the first century of our era, following the fall of Jerusalem in 70 and the resulting disorganization of Judaism, the Council of Jamnia, approximately AD 90, under the leadership of Yohanan ben Zakkai, fixed for all time the canon of scriptures. Now, again, the assumptions of Ryle's approach to the canon. He believed, and so does liberal scholarship in general, believe that many Old Testament books are late and unhistorical. Daniel was written after the prophets were canonized, and that's why Daniel is in the third division. And the Pentateuch was more organized by Ezra than it was by Moses, according to their critical view of the Pentateuch. And there was a long length of time in limbo of uncanonized books. They existed and they were circulated, but they were not recognized as canonical for a very, very long time. At least many of them, maybe even decades or perhaps even centuries before being recognized as canonical. Whereas traditionally the view was that Old Testament books were typically recognized as canonical almost immediately after their compositions. Now, again, the significance of this approach is that if it's true, then Protestants can appeal to Jesus for the Old Testament canon, because the Old Testament canon was still open until after Jesus was no longer ministering on earth. And so that would undermine an approach that we're going to actually defend later on, but it undermines the traditional approach that, of Protestants, that, because Jesus accepted the canon of the Old Testament, We should accept the canon that Jesus accepted, and the canon of his day did not include the Apocrypha, and therefore only the Hebrew Bible books are in the Old Testament canon. Well, anyway, if the canon was still open, well, it's harder to make that argument. And you can see here why Roman Catholics like this interpretation. They argue that church tradition precedes authority of the Bible, and therefore church tradition ultimately, because it's church tradition that chose which books belonged in the Bible, that church tradition has more authority than Scripture itself in some ways. So Catholics like this view because it gives an argument against an argument that Protestants give for rejecting the books of the Apocrypha. Protestants may base everything else they believe on the authority of Scripture, but Catholics say that they must base their very canon of Scripture on the authority of the Church's tradition, thus undermining the very foundation of their ideology. And church tradition, again, came to accept most of the books of the Apocrypha, and therefore the Apocrypha should be accepted as well. That's the Catholic argument. Well, I wanted to present Ryle's view by itself because it's a very important and very influential book, and still accepted by most liberal and not a few Roman Catholic scholars today. But in the videos that follow, I will respond to Ryle and give a defense of the Protestant Old Testament canon.